The first thing Caleb Thorne saw under that white blanket was a bare wrist raw from rope, and a pulse that kept fighting even when the rest of her looked like it had already quit. Summer heat sat heavy outside Tombstone, Arizona, the kind that makes the morning feel tired before it even begins. Caleb was 48, a rancher who kept his world small on purpose. He lived far enough from town that trouble usually got bored before it reached his fence. That morning, trouble did not ride in with a man. It arrived on a wagon. The wagon sat crooked near the north line, one wheel half sunk in dust. No driver. No fresh boot prints, just a mule tied to the post, chewing slow like it had been waiting all night. The canvas was gone, replaced by a white blanket pulled tight. The way you cover something you do not want the sun to see. Caleb stood there with his coffee cooling in his hand, staring at that blanket, listening for one honest sound. No bird, no wind, no town noise. Just the faint creak of leather on the mule and a sound beneath the blanket that barely counted as breathing. There was a note tucked into the knot of rope on the tailgate. The paper was cheap. The ink was bold. 2 words stood out, like somebody wanted them to burn into his eyes. Paid, delivered, no name, no destination, no signature that mattered, just a smudged seal from a shipping clerk, and a stain along the edge that looked like sweat, or worse. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had not ordered anything. He had not asked for help. He had not paid a soul in town for a single favor, not since the day he buried his wife and decided the world could keep its hands off his life. He pulled the blanket back. A young woman lay in the wagon bed, curled like she had tried to fold herself into nothing. Her hair was matted with dirt. Her lips were cracked. Her cheeks were bruised in the soft places where a hand could fit. Her wrists were tied, not with care, but with the kind of knots that say you are not a person, you are cargo. Her eyes fluttered open. She stared at Caleb like she had already met death and decided he was just another form of it. You paid for me. Now do it. Caleb did not blink. He did not flinch. He did not ask what she meant because he understood enough. In her mind, he was the buyer, the last stop, the man who owned whatever was left of her. He leaned closer, and his voice came out low, controlled, almost quiet enough to miss. I didn't buy you, and I don't take what ain't freely given. Her eyes did not soften. They hardened. That was worse. That meant there was no plan, no rules, no deal to follow. Only the empty space where mercy should have been. Then don't send me back, she whispered, and her chin trembled once before she forced it still. Do something. Caleb cut the rope with a small blade, careful not to nick her skin. When the knots fell away, her hands did not reach for him. They stayed close to her chest, guarding what little she still trusted. He lifted her anyway and carried her inside like she was the only thing that mattered. Inside the cabin, he set her in the back room and left water within reach. Then he stepped back and gave her the space to breathe. The girl watched him with eyes that measured distance like a weapon. Caleb walked back outside to the wagon. He studied it the way he studied storm clouds. He crouched by the wheels, and his stomach tightened again. The tracks were wrong, too clean, too shallow, like the wagon had been pushed into place, not driven in fast, like somebody wanted it found but did not want their own trail left behind. On the tailgate, beneath the blanket, there was something else. A faint mark in the wood, pressed hard enough to leave an impression. Not a brand, not a name, but a symbol, simple and deliberate. It was the kind of mark a man uses when he thinks no one will question him. Caleb's hand hovered over it. His fingers shook once, just once, the way they had not shaken in years, because he had seen that symbol before. And the last time he saw it, he stood beside a fresh grave, listening to a preacher talk about heaven while the desert swallowed the only thing he ever loved. Caleb stood up slowly and stared toward his cabin window. The girl was still there, still watching, still waiting for the moment kindness turned into a trap. In town, men like Silas Crow did not leave gifts on fences. Men like that left warnings or bait. Caleb took a breath, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something sharper than grief. He felt a decision. If that wagon was a message, then somebody had chosen the wrong ranch to send it to. If that girl was property, then somebody was about to learn what happened when you tried to deliver a human soul like a sack of feed. But here was the question that would decide everything. If Caleb didn't pay for her, then who did? And why leave her under a white blanket at his fence? Unless they wanted him to open the door to a war, he swore he'd never fight again. Caleb sat at his kitchen table with that cheap note in his hand, and the cabin felt smaller than it ever had. He knew the wagon wasn't an accident, and he knew the next move had to be his. Eliza was in the back room, breathing shallow, eyes open more than closed. She hadn't touched the food yet. She hadn't asked for a name. She hadn't asked for mercy either. She just watched every sound like it was a warning. Under lamplight, Caleb studied the seal and knew it had come through a ledger, which meant a man in town knew more than he was saying. He stepped to the back room doorway and spoke soft, so his voice wouldn't sound like a command. "My name's Caleb." Eliza's eyes flicked up. She said nothing. "I'm going into town. I'm coming back. I don't leave folks behind." That got a reaction. Her shoulders tightened. Caleb held both hands up, palms open. "I'm not leaving you for them. I'm going to find out who thinks they can leave a human being on my fence like a sack of grain." Eliza swallowed. Her voice came out thin. "If you go to town, they'll hear." Caleb nodded. "That's why I'm going." He left her a loaded lantern, then stopped himself and took the bullets back out of it. He didn't want her thinking the only option was a gun. He wanted her thinking there was another way. Before he saddled his horse, he put a piece of chalk on the table in the back room. One small thing she could hold, something simple, that said, "You're not helpless here." Then he rode. He went straight to the shipping yard, where the air smelled like hay, sweat, and money. A clerk sat behind a counter with a ledger thick as a church Bible. The man looked up, saw Caleb, and forced a smile like it was his job. "Morning, Mr. Thorne." Caleb set the note down. "You recognize that seal." The clerk glanced, then tried to act bored. "Lots of seals." Caleb leaned in just a little. His voice stayed calm. "Don't make me start guessing." The clerk licked his lips. "That's Benson Yard. Freight comes up through there. Sometimes gets relabeled for convenience." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Relabeled." The clerk shrugged like it was weather. "Paperwork travels faster than truth." Caleb slid a coin across the counter. Not as a bribe, more like a reminder that men talked easier when they felt paid for their trouble. He hated doing it. He did it anyway. The clerk opened the ledger. "You did send money last month. Supplies, nails, flour, lamp oil, some tack." Caleb nodded. "I know what I ordered." The clerk tapped a line with his finger. "Here's the problem. Somebody added a second line item under the same payment. Special delivery. No description." Caleb stared at it, and his stomach turned cold. The clerk lowered his voice. "That kind of line doesn't get added by accident." Caleb didn't ask who did it. He already knew the shape of the answer. He'd seen that symbol on the wagon. He'd felt the old memory clawing back. That mark belonged to Silas Crow, a man who sold anything that couldn't fight back, and smiled while he did it. Caleb pushed away from the counter. "Who signed off on it?" The clerk hesitated. "You don't want that." Caleb leaned closer. "I don't want a girl dropped on my fence either." The clerk swallowed. "A runner. One of Crow's boys. Tall red scarf. Talks like he's got friends in the sheriff's office." Caleb left without another word. Outside, the sun felt meaner. The town felt louder. He rode to the small office near the courthouse, where the justice of the peace kept his stamp and his patience. The man inside was older. Sleeves rolled up, ink on his fingers. He looked like somebody who'd spent a lifetime turning chaos into paper. Caleb stepped in. "I need a marriage certificate." The old man blinked. "You looking to start over?" Caleb didn't smile. "I'm looking to stop something." The justice studied him, then leaned back. "Is the young lady here?" "No." "That's not how this works." Caleb nodded. "I know. I'll bring her. If she agrees." The justice's eyes sharpened. "She better agree." Caleb's voice dropped. She's been treated like property. I'm trying to make her legally untouchable." The room went quiet. The justice exhaled slow. Crow. Caleb didn't answer, because he didn't have to. The justice rubbed his jaw. "Bring her tomorrow morning. Bring a witness." And Caleb. "And bring anything that breathes and can testify. Paper helps, but a living witness is what makes men sweat." "What do you mean if you do this? You're stepping into a fight you can't unstep out of." Caleb nodded once. "Already did." He rode back hard, dust rising behind him like a warning flare. When he reached the ranch, Eliza was standing in the doorway, lantern in hand, shoulders tight like she'd been holding herself together by sheer will. She looked at his face and knew it wasn't good. Caleb dismounted slow. "They changed the paperwork." Eliza's eyes flicked down. "So it's true." "No." Caleb's voice stayed steady. "It's a lie they want to make true." He walked closer, careful not to crowd her. "There's one way to cut their hands off, at least on paper." Eliza stared, confused and afraid. "What way?" "We go to the justice. We do the papers the right way, Spab. Not because a piece of paper magically saves anyone, but because it buys us time, and it gives you a legal name beside mine when we step in front of a judge, for the first time since she arrived." Eliza's expression cracked, not into a smile, into disbelief. "You don't even know me." Caleb nodded. "I know what they did to you, and I know what they'll do if you're still just a line item in a ledger." Eliza's fingers tightened on the lantern, and after... Caleb's voice softened, just a touch. "After you decide what you want. You want to leave, you leave. You want to stay, you stay. But right now, I'm giving you a shield." Eliza looked past him toward the empty road, like she could already see men coming. Then she whispered, almost the same words as before, but different now. "You paid for me. Now do it." Caleb nodded. "All right." He turned toward the barn to saddle up again, and that's when he heard it. A faint creak at the fence, sound like leather shifting on wood, like someone leaning close, listening. Caleb froze, eyes narrowing, because the road was empty, but the ranch didn't feel empty anymore. How long had somebody been watching, and were they about to let Caleb ride into town with Eliza, or take her first? Caleb froze for one beat. Then his body decided for him, like the wood itself was warning him. Eliza saw the change in his face. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't have to. She had lived long enough in fear to recognize it in other people. Caleb set his hand on the stall door, slow and quiet, then eased it shut. He didn't want the horses spooking. He didn't want Eliza spooking more than she already was. He stepped away from the barn and walked toward the fence like he was taking a casual stroll, the kind a man takes when he's checking a post. But his eyes were sharp, and his right hand stayed loose near his belt. "Eliza," he said, without turning around, "stay inside. Lock the door. If you hear me whistle, you go to the back room and you don't come out." Her voice came thin from the doorway. "I don't want to be alone." Caleb paused for half a breath. "I know." Then he kept walking. When he reached the fence line, he saw it. A hat brim low, a shoulder pressed against the post like the man had been there long enough to get comfortable. He was tall, lean, and he wore a red scarf like he wanted to be remembered. The stranger smiled, slow and smug, the way men smile when they think the law is their cousin. "Evening, Mr. Thorne," he said. "Heard something showed up on your fence, something that ain't supposed to stay." Caleb didn't answer. He just looked the man over, boots to eyes, like he was deciding how much trouble could fit inside one body. The man nodded toward the cabin. "I'm here to make sure you don't get confused about what belongs to who." Caleb's voice stayed calm. "You've got the wrong ranch." The stranger chuckled. "No, I've got the right one. The ledger says money moved. The ledger says you're the name on the line. And folks in town trust paper more than they trust people." Caleb took one step closer. "Paper can say a lot of things." The man's smile thinned. Crow don't like delay. He don't like questions and either. So let's keep this simple. He shifted his weight like he was about to walk right past Caleb toward the door. That was the moment Caleb moved. Caleb moved fast. One hard turn, one clean punch, and the man stopped acting brave. The stranger made a sound that was more surprise than pain. Eliza gasped from the doorway. Caleb kept his eyes on him. Because trouble only needs 1 second, Caleb tightened his grip and spoke low. You're going to sit down. You're going to stay calm. And you're going to tell me who sent you. The stranger's eyes flashed. You know who. Silas Crow. Caleb nodded, like that name tasted bitter but familiar. The stranger tried to jerk free. Caleb shoved him down into the dust, put a knee between his shoulder blades, and pulled out a length of rope from the saddle. A rancher always has rope. Some men keep a Bible by the bed. Out here, rope is the thing you reach for. Within seconds, the stranger's wrists were bound, tight enough to hold, not tight enough to cut. Caleb wasn't looking to kill. He was looking to make a point that would travel faster than gossip. He dragged the man to the hitching post and tied him there like a bad decision that needed time to think. Only then did Caleb turn to Eliza. She stood in the doorway, lantern shaking in her hands. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide, not with curiosity, but with that old fear trying to climb back onto her shoulders. Caleb kept his voice steady. You're safe. Eliza swallowed. For how long? Caleb looked at the bound man, then back at her. Long enough to get you your shield. The stranger laughed through a split lip. Shield. That's cute. You think Crow cares about shields. Caleb walked up close, crouched so he was eye level with him. Crow cares about money. Crow cares about control. Crow cares about what people will believe. The stranger's grin returned. Then believe this. You ride into town with her, you'll ride back in irons. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Who's helping him in town? The stranger hesitated. Just a beat too long. Caleb smiled, and it wasn't friendly. That pause tells me everything. The stranger snapped his jaw shut, but it was too late. Caleb had his answer. Crow had friends in the sheriff's office, and maybe in the shipping yard, too. Maybe even closer than that. Caleb stood and brushed dust from his hands. Eliza, go inside. Eliza didn't move. I don't want to leave you out here with him. Caleb's voice softened. I'm not leaving you. I'm finishing this right. Eliza's eyes flicked to the rope on the man's wrists. Is that what he meant by do it? Caleb paused. No. He glanced at the cabin, then back to her. When you said, you paid for me. Now do it. I heard something different. Eliza's brow tightened. What? I heard a woman asking someone to stop the next bad thing. Caleb nodded toward the road. And I'm about to... He stepped toward her, slow, so she didn't flinch. We're going to town at first light. And if anyone thinks they can take you, they better bring more than paperwork. We're going to see the justice. We're going to get that certificate. Then Crow can shout all he wants. On paper, you'll be my wife, which means if Crow tries to claim you as cargo, he has to do it in daylight. And daylight makes liars nervous. Eliza stared at him like she couldn't decide if she should be angry or relieved. You'd do that for a stranger. Caleb shrugged. And I've been the stranger before. The bound man coughed out a laugh. You do this. You're starting a war. Caleb looked at him, calm as sunrise. No, you started it when you left her under a white blanket at my fence. Eliza's grip tightened on the lantern. Her voice dropped. What if they come tonight? Caleb nodded toward the window. Then they'll find out I'm not most men. If you're still with me, pour yourself a little tea or coffee if it's one of those days, and settle in. Then tell me this. What time is it where you are right now, and where are you listening from? And if you want the rest of this story, go ahead and subscribe, so you don't lose the trail when it turns dark. 'Cause right then, out past the fence, Caleb heard a second horse breathe in the dust, and this time the rider didn't bother to hide at all. The second rider did not stop at the fence. He came straight in, slow and confident, like the land already belonged to him. His horse was dark, well-fed, and calm, which told Caleb everything he needed to know. This wasn't some kid running errands. This was the kind of man who speaks soft, because he's used to being obeyed. Eliza stepped back into the doorway, lantern shaking again, her eyes locked on the rider's face, and something old and painful crossed her expression. Caleb saw it. That one's Silas Crow. Caleb said. The rider swung down easy, dust settling around his boots. He looked at the man tied to the post, then at Caleb, then finally at Eliza, like she was a misplaced item that annoyed him. "Well," the rider said, voice smooth, "looks like you made a mess of a simple delivery." He smiled like the law owed him money. Caleb stayed where he was. "You lost your nerve sending boys instead of coming yourself." The rider smiled thin. "I wanted to see how you handled it." Eliza's voice came out before she could stop it. "Don't listen to him." The rider's eyes flicked to her. "Still breathing. That's good. Means we can finish business." Caleb stepped between them. Not aggressive, just final. "There's no business here," the rider chuckled. "There is if money changed hands." Caleb shook his head. It didn't. The rider reached into his coat and pulled out folded papers, neat and clean, like he'd practiced this moment. "Says here it did," Caleb said. "Paper can be made to say anything." Eliza hugged the lantern to her chest. "He married me." The rider blinked, just once. That was all the proof Caleb needed. "Excuse me," the rider said. Caleb kept his voice level. "We signed before a justice witnessed." The rider laughed, louder this time. "You think that stops anything?" Caleb nodded. "It stops you from calling her property." The rider's smile faded. "You just made yourself a problem." Caleb took a step closer. "That happened when you left her under a blanket at my fence." The rider glanced at the bound man. "You should untie him." Caleb did not move. The rider sighed. "You don't understand how this works. Men like you live because men like me allow it." Eliza spoke, her voice shaking but clear. "You don't own me anymore." The rider looked at her. Truly looked this time. And something hard flashed behind his eyes. "You never were anything but a debt." Caleb felt that land in his chest like a hammer. "You're done here," Caleb said. The rider shook his head slowly. "No, I'm just getting started. By morning, there will be a complaint waiting in Tucson. Kidnapping, fraud. Anything that makes a badge look at you first and the truth last. And when the law comes, it won't matter what you say. It'll matter who they believe." Caleb smiled, and it surprised even him. "That's why we're going to Tucson first." The rider's eyes narrowed. "You won't make it." Caleb nodded toward the tied man. "He will." The rider laughed again, but this time it sounded tight. "You think one fool at a post scares me." Caleb stepped closer, close enough that the rider could smell dust and leather. "No, but he's proof, and proof travels." The rider mounted his horse, slow, deliberate. "You're choosing the hard way." Caleb met his eyes. "I always do." The rider turned his horse and rode off without another word. Dust settled. The message stayed. Eliza sagged against the doorframe, like the last bit of strength had finally run out of her. Caleb crossed to her, careful, steady. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her eyes said otherwise. "He's not done." Caleb shook his head. "Neither are we." They moved fast after that. Caleb loaded water, food, bay, and rope. He kept the bound man tied, but shaded, because dead witnesses don't help anyone. Eliza changed into clothes that fit, simple and clean, like a person again. As the sun dipped low, they stood by the horses. "You don't owe me this," Eliza said. Caleb tightened a strap. "I know. Then why?" she asked. "Because letting evil keep quiet is how decent men lose." Caleb paused, because once, a long time ago, someone asked me to do something, and I didn't. I won't make that mistake again. Eliza swallowed. "What if Tucson doesn't listen?" Caleb looked toward the road. "Then we make them." They mounted up as the sky turned orange, the tied man between them, dust rising under hooves, behind them. The ranch went quiet again, like it was holding its breath. Ahead of them, Tucson waited, and with it, men who wore badges and smiles and decided who mattered. And as they rode, Eliza leaned closer and whispered, "If this goes wrong, what happens to me?" Caleb answered without hesitation, "You stay my wife until you choose otherwise." Eliza nodded slowly, and for the first time, she did not look afraid. But out on the road, far behind them, another rider turned south, heading straight for Tucson, carrying a message that would make sure the law was already waiting when Caleb arrived. The question now was simple. Would the truth get there first, or would the lie be wearing a badge when they rode into town? By the next evening, their horses were tired, and their throats were dry. They reached Tucson with dust in their teeth and sunset behind their backs, and Caleb could feel the town watching before anyone even spoke. In Tucson, eyes followed them, and the wrong eyes followed closest. The bound man rode behind, wrists tied to the saddle horn, head down, breathing hard. A living witness looks like trouble to a guilty man, and Caleb wanted everybody to see trouble was coming. "You all right?" Caleb asked. Eliza nodded once. "I'm standing." "That's something." Caleb almost smiled. "That's plenty." They headed toward the justice's office first, because paper is a kind of weapon in towns like this. But they didn't make it 2 blocks. A deputy stepped out from the shade like he'd been waiting on purpose. He had a clean shirt, a clean gun belt, and a face that looked friendly in the same way a trap looks smooth. "Caleb Thorne," the deputy said, like he was reading it off a list. "You're a long way from home." Caleb stopped his horse. "Just passing through." The deputy's eyes slid to Eliza. "And who's this?" Eliza's shoulders tightened, but she lifted her chin. "My name's Eliza." The deputy smiled. "I didn't ask your name." Caleb's voice went flat. "She's my wife." The deputy raised his eyebrows, like that amused him. "Your wife?" Eliza spoke quick, steady. "Yes, we were married in Tombstone." The deputy's smile stayed, but his eyes didn't. "Funny. I got a telegram about a missing girl. Says she was taken against her will." Caleb felt it in his chest. There it was. The lie, already dressed up and waiting. "Show me," Caleb said. The deputy pulled a folded telegram from his pocket and held it just out of reach. "I can read it aloud if you like." Caleb didn't blink. "Read it." The deputy cleared his throat, enjoying the attention. "Female, early 20s, property dispute, possible kidnapping, buyer claims fraud. Hold the rancher. If located." Eliza's hands went cold. Caleb could feel her breathing change beside him. Caleb leaned forward a little. "Buyer claims." The deputy nodded. "That's what it says." Caleb looked at the deputy's belt, then at the way the man stood, too confident, too ready. This wasn't just a deputy doing his job. This was a deputy doing someone else's work. Caleb pointed toward the bound man behind them. "You want your answers. Start with him." The deputy glanced back, and for the first time his smile slipped. "Just a hair. That was enough." "What's that?" the deputy asked. "A witness," Caleb said. "A man who came to my ranch to collect my wife like she was freight." Eliza swallowed. "He called me a delivery." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "You got some nerve bringing a tied man into my town?" Caleb shrugged. "I got more nerve than sense sometimes." The deputy stepped closer to Eliza. Too close. "Ma'am, did you go with Caleb Thorne willingly?" Eliza's throat worked. Caleb waited, because this was her moment, not his. Eliza spoke clear. "I was left on his fence under a blanket. I was tied. I was hurt. He cut the rope. He carried me inside. I married him because I wanted to live." The deputy's mouth tightened. "So you admit you married him under pressure?" Eliza's eyes flashed. "Under pressure from the men who sold me." "Not from him." Caleb watched the deputy's face and saw it. The deputy wasn't listening for truth. He was listening for a single word he could twist. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out the marriage certificate. Folded careful, he held it up for the onlookers, not just the deputy. Justice signed it. Caleb said, "Witness signed it. You want to call it fraud. You can take it up with the justice. The deputy didn't touch the paper. We can sort all that out at the station." Caleb's voice stayed calm. No. The deputy's hand drifted toward his gun. Excuse me. Caleb didn't move. If you're going to arrest someone, arrest the man who came to collect her. The deputy's eyes flicked back again. He was calculating now. If he took Caleb, he'd have to explain the bound man. If he took the bound man, he'd have to admit there was a collector. Either way, somebody important would get nervous. Liza leaned toward Caleb and whispered, "He's stalling." Caleb nodded. "I know." A second deputy appeared at the corner, then a third. Too many, too quick, like they'd been told where to stand. Caleb turned his head slightly toward Eliza. "When I whistle, you do exactly what we practiced." Eliza's voice barely moved. "Hide." "Stay quiet." Caleb nodded. "Good." The first deputy forced a smile again, trying to make it look normal. "Mr. Thorne, just come along. Let's have a friendly talk." Caleb had seen this kind of normal before. It was the kind that shows up when someone powerful already paid for the ending. Caleb looked at him. "You're not friendly." The deputy's smile dropped. "Last chance." Caleb's eyes went to the crowd, then to the bound witness, then to Eliza. He could feel the town closing in like a gate. And that's when the bound man suddenly lifted his head and whispered something that made Eliza's face drain of color. "The Badlands outside town. A handoff spot and the rocks quiet enough to do bad business." Liza's fingers tightened on Caleb's sleeve. "What does he mean?" Caleb did not answer right away. He kept his eyes on the deputies because the truth was, answering out loud would have been a gift to men who were already twisting every word. He leaned in close to Eliza, voice low. "It means they already picked the place they want you to disappear." Eliza's breath caught. "So what do we do?" Caleb looked at her, and for the first time since that wagon, his face softened. "We do what they don't expect." He turned to the deputy with the telegram. "You want me to come with you? Fine. But first, you're going to read that message again, loud. So every person standing here hears who is accusing who." The deputy frowned. "That's not how this works." Caleb nodded toward the crowd. "It will if you care about your town. If you don't, then you won't mind saying it out loud." A few people in the crowd shifted. A man with gray in his beard narrowed his eyes. A woman pulled her child closer. Folks over 40 know what it looks like when power is leaning on someone. They may not always fight it, but they recognize it. The deputy cleared his throat and read it again, louder. When he said buyer claims a few heads turned. When he said hold the rancher, a few more did. Caleb raised the marriage paper so the crowd could see it. "This says she's my wife. This says she chose. If you want to call her property, then you're calling a living, breathing woman property. Right here in the street." The deputy's jaw worked. Nobody said property. The bound man behind Caleb coughed and muttered. "Crow did." That one word hit the crowd like a rock dropped in a tin bucket. Crow. People knew that name. Maybe they didn't say it loud at church, but they knew it. The deputy's eyes snapped to the witness. "Shut up." Caleb's voice stayed calm. "You don't get to tell a witness to shut up. Not if you're the good guy." The deputy took a step forward. Caleb did not move. He only whistled, sharp and quick. Eliza turned without hesitation. She slipped between two wagons, then into the nearest doorway. The way they had practiced. No screaming, no begging. Just movement, just will. The deputy lunged as if to stop her, and that told the crowd everything. A man in the crowd stepped out, blocking the deputy's path. "Hold on now. Why is she running if she's your missing girl?" Another voice chimed in. "Why is he trying so hard to keep her quiet?" Caleb did not smile, but inside something eased. Sometimes you don't need a hero. Sometimes you need a few regular people who finally decide they're tired of being played. The deputy looked around and realized he had lost the clean stage he wanted. He had a crowd now, not a corner. Caleb leaned closer. "You can take me to your station if you want, but you touch her, and this whole street will remember your face." The deputy's mouth tightened. "You think you can threaten the law?" Caleb shook his head. "No. I think you've been wearing it like a costume." The deputy signaled the other men. Two of them moved toward Caleb. Caleb raised a hand. "Before you do that, I want you to look at this." He nodded toward the marriage paper again. "If you haul me in, you're hauling in her husband. That's a courthouse mess. If you haul her in, you're hauling in a wife with a witness saying Crow tried to collect her like freight. That's a bigger mess." The deputy hesitated, and that hesitation was the crack where truth could get in. From inside the doorway, Eliza called out, not loud, but loud enough. "I'm not going to the Badlands. I'm not going anywhere with your men." The crowd murmured. The Badlands weren't a place you wandered into by accident. It was the kind of country where a wagon could vanish for an hour, and no one would hear a thing. Caleb looked at the crowd. "I found her tied up under a blanket. If that doesn't bother you, you're asleep. And if it does bother you, then don't let a crooked badge tell you it's none of your business." Now that line landed. You could feel it in the crowd. The deputy straightened up. "Trying to regain control? This is official business. Oh, clear out." Nobody moved. Caleb looked toward the doorway, where Eliza stood with her hands clenched, eyes steady now. She was still scared, but she was not silent anymore. Caleb turned back to the deputy. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to let me take my wife to the courthouse. You're going to let this witness speak to a judge. If you try to stop it, you better be ready to explain to this whole town why you're protecting Silas Crow." The deputy's face twitched about. He knew he was cornered, not by a gun, by daylight. And that is the part people forget about the Old West. Sure, there were shootouts, but the most dangerous thing to a crooked man was often a public question he couldn't answer. Eliza stepped out, shoulders squared. She looked at Caleb and said softly, "You didn't just carry me inside that day. You carried me back to myself." Caleb swallowed hard. "You did that." They walked together toward the courthouse, slow and steady. The crowd parted. The deputies followed at a distance, angry and trapped. Hours later, the sun was lower, and the street felt different. The deputy's smile was gone. The witness was in a cell, talking fast. And Crow's name was finally being spoken out loud by people who used to whisper it. That night, Caleb and Eliza rode back out of Tucson, not running, just leaving. The desert looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. Eliza held the reins with steady hands now. Caleb glanced at her and said, "Now you decide." Eliza looked at the dark line of their ranch in the distance, and she nodded once. "I decide to stay." So here's the question: when the lie shows up wearing a badge, do you stay quiet or stand where the truth can see you? That day, Caleb did what most men would not. He used paper, patience, and backbone. Not because he was fearless, but because he was tired of living in a world where evil wins just by being quiet. Eliza did the hardest part. She stopped believing she was property. The West could be cruel. That part is true. If this story hit home, hit like and subscribe for more Western tales with backbone. When cruelty shows up at your fence, what kind of person do you choose to be?